Good morning. We are ready to get started. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends and comrades, brothers and sisters of the Rural Water Grand Enterprise. Thank you for coming. In this session, we will hear from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the state drinking water agencies through the Association of Drinking Water Administrators, or ASDWA, and the state groundwater protection agencies through the Groundwater Protection Council, GWPC. We are honored and very appreciative to have our guest speakers here today, who I will introduce momentarily. What do EPA, ASDWA, and GWPC have in common besides being acronyms? They are all regulatory authorities. And what do you in the audience have in common besides excitement? Any guesses? You are all regulated authorities. And please don't take that as a criticism. It does not make you any less significant, and I do apologize if this is news to you. As we pointed out at this session last year, the ratio of regulators to the regulated is about maybe 100 to 1. This should not alarm our guest speakers, as everyone in the audience believes that diplomacy is the most effective method of engagement. So you're basically looking at 250 rural water ambassadors. Dear audience, we know that many of you come to forums like these to be heard as well as hearing from the experts. You will have your chance. Much of the time in this session will be dedicated to questions from the audience shortly after opening statements, so I urge you to be thinking of what you want to ask. I do have questions that have been submitted in advance from the media, which I will try to get to. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to conduct a little audience participation exercise so our guests can get an idea of who is here. Would you indulge this? Thank you. Applaud appropriately as the questions are asked. First, who here works for a drinking water supply as an operator or operations specialist? Thank you. Anyone? Any governmental officials, councilmen, mayors, county commissioners, judges? Thank you, Your Honor. Any farmers? Anyone with rates that are too low? Anyone with rates that are too high? Anyone with a governing board that does not want to increase rates? Get to some environmental questions here. Anyone who thinks fracking is safe for groundwater supplies? Anyone who believes fracking is too risky for groundwater supplies? That was about an even split. Yeah. Is the disinfection byproducts rule a problem? Okay. Let's hear the other side. Is the disinfection byproducts rule not a problem? There's still some people filtering in. Do you think the lead and copper samples taken with a chain of custody from homeowners are accurate? I said they're accurate. Do you think they're not accurate? Okay, last question. Is anyone here representing the best managed and operated water supply in the world? That's very impressive. Thank you for participating, and now let's meet our guests. I will introduce them all now, and then we will hear opening statements from each. I have adumbrated their very accomplished resumes to 5 key accomplishments, and I encourage you to show any sign of approval for any of their professional accomplishments that you most appreciate. First, to my right, is Dr. Peter Gravatt, with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Peter is the director of the Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. He is a scientist with a specialty in children's health issues. In his current position, he is responsible for the construction and implementation of all Safe Drinking Water Act regulations and programs. This is Peter's first presentation at our annual conference. Lastly, Peter's name and signature appears on the January 3rd, 2013 EPA order allowing for all of your consumer confidence reports to now be published on the internet. Thank you. Next is Jim Taft, who's at the end, Executive Director of the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, or primacy agencies, which are charged with implementing the state drinking water programs. In a previous life, Jim was a respected technical engineer in the EPA's Office of Water. Before that, Jim worked for wastewater utilities in New Jersey and Ohio. Lastly, Jim's association members are responsible for allocating over $10 million annually in technical assistance funding to state rural water associations across the country. In the middle is Mike Paik, the Executive Director of the Groundwater Agencies. These are the state agencies that carry out the federally delegated underground injection control regulations, which include energy environmental regulation, including hydraulic fracturing. But often they are also the groundwater programs agency. Mike has been with GWPC for a number of decades and comes from a planning background. And lastly, Mike is the current board member of a very rural water district in rural Oklahoma, and I think he may even be the chairman. Now we're ready to hear from our guests. We will begin with Dr. Gravatt. Please proceed.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. Good to see you all this morning. So you referred to our presentations as opening statements. And I want to make sure I'm clear on what you would like me to do. I have a fairly long opening statement here. So maybe I'll run through that, and when people start to either nod off or look like they're in pain, or now I'm not going to look down at Charles and see if he's in pain, because there may be other reasons why Charles is going to be increasingly in pain over the days here as we get closer to his lovely only daughter's wedding this weekend. But Sam and Doug, you can signal me when you're like, you can give me the Kent, you can give me it's time, stop. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a great year for me to connect with rural water. You know, I started in the spring of this year down at the Georgia Rural Water Conference, and Doug was a tremendous host down there, had a fabulous time at your meeting, and then we had some time with Sam in Oklahoma when I was at the Aqua meeting, and I've been telling Sam for years now, in the time that I've been in the job, I want to come out and see some rural water systems, so we had a chance to do that, and I'll talk about that. It's good to be here. So it is my first meeting at your annual conference. I think I get a bye. Last year, you know, we had every intent of being in Louisville, and then the folks who work in Washington had some other ideas about whether we were going to be working when you were doing your thing. So we were sorry not to be able to participate. So a couple thoughts at the outset. You know, this is the 40th anniversary of the Safe Drinking Water Act, and we take some great, I think, pride and pleasure, as I know many of you do, in the great accomplishments that have been realized over these last 40 years. You know, every day Americans drink 1 billion glasses of water across the United States, and safe drinking water is central to every community in the U.S. And they use clean water for cooking and washing and bathing, and it's vital for schools and industries and for businesses all across the country. And looking back, before SIDWA, you know, we lacked the authorities that we have today, some of which I understand are controversial and perhaps need some additional work. We also lacked some of the science and technology. We lacked some of the funding that we have had over the last several years as a result of the Drinking Water SRF. In 1962, there were 28 regulated substances. Now there are many more than that. 40% of the systems that delivered water did not meet all 28 of those drinking water standards. Over 50% of the facilities in the U.S. 40 years ago had problems with disinfection or with clarification or pressurization in the distribution system. And we're really the leader in the world today in terms of safe drinking water. And 290 million people depend every day on the water that's provided by some 50,000 systems across the U.S. And residential customers pay on average $2.89 per 1,000 gallons of water. So I stayed over at the Hyatt. The Hyatt is a lovely hotel. I had a wonderful time at the Hyatt. Everything about it was beautiful. And the cost of water per 1,000 gallons in my room was just shy of $20,000 per 1,000 gallons. $289, $20,000. I'm not kidding. $20,000 per 1,000 gallons. Okay, so I think we have a tremendous value and a gift to the United States population here. So since 1997, the Drinking Water SRF has funded really over $25 billion of projects, leverage a lot of funding, most of those projects in small systems, right? And that's an important part of what the SRF does. And I understand that some of you might be thinking, as I'm talking about the 40th anniversary of the Safe Drinking Water Act, that it's the Safe Drinking Water Act that's responsible for providing safe drinking water to the United States population. And I understand that as drinking water operations specialists, like many of you in the room and all across the country, who are the ones who are responsible for providing safe drinking water to the United States people. It's what you do every day. Now, the Act creates some framework for us and some regulations that we follow, but it's the work that you do that makes the difference. So I mentioned I was in Oklahoma in July, and I had a great chance to sit down with James Gamble. Is James here in the room? He's not. Okay. Well, he was in the room when I was in Oklahoma, and I said to Sam and James, I would like to go see some small systems. And we went to Grady number 6 outside of Oklahoma City, and we also went over to the Goldsby system. And Paul Jones and Ronnie Nelson were great hosts for me that day when I went and visited their systems. I just want to talk a little bit about what I saw at Grady number 6. So I sat down with Paul, and here's a guy who's been on the job for maybe 5, 7 years, something like that, in Grady number 6. He comes on the job. The system was a system that purchased water from a wholesaler that lost about 40% of that water in the distribution system through leakage. And that's what happened when he started. Today, Paul, working with his board, a really visionary board, said, number one, we got to get rid of these leaks. So he's been using advanced leak detection systems to identify where the biggest leaks are and addressing them. They're down below 25% leakage, and their goal is to go far below that. In addition, they said, do we really want our community to rely on the water we buy from a different wholesaler going into the future? Or do we want to be in control of our own destiny? And so with the support of the board, they drilled their own wells. They now have their own wells, their own drinking water system. They've knocked down the leakage. They're doing everything in Grady number 6 that we would hope community water systems would do all across the United States. So what I took from that is I don't want anyone to tell me that small system operations specialists don't know how to provide safe drinking water to their communities, don't know how to provide leadership about how the work needs to be done across the U.S. It was a great experience, and great compliments to the folks there in Oklahoma who I met. And I understand that there are challenges going forward for both systems large and small, and I understand that in small systems there are difficulties around having sufficient resources to do the work. We know that system operations specialists need to earn a living wage if they're going to be able to stay there and work over the long run, right? And so these are challenges going forward. So today, 92%, roughly, a little more than 92% of the drinking water systems across the United States meet all health-based standards, and the vast majority of those systems are small, right? So great examples all across the U.S. of small systems doing what needs to be done to provide high-quality drinking water to their populations. Now, this is a year where we've seen some pretty significant challenges, especially around source water protection. The small systems that have those challenges haven't necessarily made the front page of the New York Times, but certainly we heard a lot about Charleston in January, when Charleston had that leak at the Freedom Industries facility and leaked a chemical which actually was known we knew almost nothing about this chemical. That leaked into the, are we good, Mike? You said, let me know if I need to do something different. He's like, oh my God, this guy's talking a long time. He's still got a lot of pages. And when the Freedom Industries spill happened, we had 300,000 people in Charleston who were out of water for almost 5 days. The governor of West Virginia estimated that the cost to the economy of West Virginia was over $70 million over those 5 days. And then we saw in early August, we saw in Toledo, another major system serving nearly 500,000 people between the city and the small communities that were served by Toledo around the outskirts of the town were out of water for 2 days. To see, turn on the nightly news and see these pictures of lines of people with their bottles waiting to get drinking water was really quite a thing. And points to some of the challenges that we have going forward in terms of source water protection. And I know these issues play out in small systems. I was talking at breakfast this morning with Sam and Doug, and one of the things I observed was that, Carroll Township, just down the road from Toledo last year, not this year, last year, they had an impact from algal toxins. They had to shut down, but they had a connection with a neighbor. So they were down for a lot less time than Toledo was. In some ways, small systems are better positioned to address these sorts of challenges than some of the large ones are. I think I just want to also mention that another important part of the work we've been doing this year is working very closely with Charles and Patty Cleveland on the Water System Coordinating Council to make sure we're on top of issues like cybersecurity and emergency response preparedness. So in terms of some of the challenges going forward, we have our water needs assessment for the drinking water program estimates about $384 billion gap in funding over the next 20 years. One of the key assumptions in that needs assessment is that pipe will be replaced at a 0.5% rate annually, which means that pipe is assumed to last 200 years when you put it in the ground. I think most of you would probably say that might seem a little high, in terms of how long pipe's going to last. So the need, if anything, is probably much greater than that. We're seeing tremendous challenges from drought across the country. We were talking about how in Delaware they were struggling with drought over the last few years. In Georgia, I know you're struggling with drought. And certainly in Texas and in California and in Oklahoma, extraordinary challenges with drought and trying to figure out how we're going to provide safe drinking water to folks when there's very little water to be had. Looking at ways that we need to try and balance going forward the needs of energy production, and it is a great blessing that we have now the U.S., the largest energy producer in the globe, right? A great opportunity for the U.S., and at the same time presents some challenges in terms of water needs to support those activities. So I also want to mention that we're very pleased this year to be continuing to fund the National Rural Water Association through our Competitive Small Systems Grant. And we have another solicitation out, which I guess it's already closed. It's a $12.7 million solicitation, and I assume that NRWA will be one of those entities that will be interested and continue to be funded. And we're very proud of that partnership that we've had with you over the years. And very pleased with the work that you all are doing. A couple quick notes on some regulations, and then I'll step down and get out of the way from my colleagues here. You mentioned the lead and copper rule. So the lead and copper rule is a rule that we were prepared, EPA was prepared to propose a new rule back when I started in the job about 2 years ago. And my assessment was And the administrator's assessment was that we weren't quite ready to do that. That we had a proposal that we were putting together that there were a number of different pieces there, moving parts that individually might have made some sense on paper, but when you tried to put them together, I scratched my head and said, how is this all going to work? How is this going to get us to where we want to be? And so I decided that the right thing to do would be to reach out to our National Drinking Water Advisory Council and ask them for some help. Let's roll up our sleeves and let's look at this again a little bit more carefully. Mike, you sent us John Sasser from Massachusetts, who's been a great member of the work group, who's been working through these issues. We're looking at questions like, sampling by residents of drinking water for the lead and copper rule and how to make that process work better. I think I heard a sense that maybe that's an area where there could be some opportunity for improvement. So we'll be looking at that. We're going to be looking at the issue of partial lead line replacements, copper sampling as well, public education. So we've had several meetings of this group. We're thinking through. They're going to be providing us with some input about how we might be able to improve the rule. The overall goal is to improve public health protections in a way that can be effectively implemented by drinking water systems, large and small, all across the United States. So stay tuned for where we're going with that. The third regulatory determination under the Safe Drinking Water Act, you've heard me say that's coming soon, and I'll say again, it's coming soon. And this time, I think it's coming very soon. So I expect before the end of the year, you'll see the third regulatory determination done, and we'll have an opportunity to roll up our sleeves together and look at how we go forward once that's completed and on the street. UCMR 3, the national sampling effort. Many of you have been participating in that effort. Thank you very much. You know, this is where we sample systems large and small across the United States to try and understand the prevalence and concentration of a variety of drinking water contaminants in the nation's drinking water systems. It's an early step in determining whether we ought to be doing future regulations of different compounds. It's too early at this point to get a read on how the agency might proceed in terms of the results of the sampling that we've gotten. But a couple highlights: chlorate has shown up in about 17% of the samples and 35% of public water systems. 1,4-dioxane, which was the subject of an NPR story earlier this year, has not been detected above the 1 in 10,000 cancer risk level in UCMR. Chromium-6 has shown up in 76% of the samples and by 90% of the public water system sampled, with only a few above the new California limit. And strontium was detected by almost every system. There's additional work that we'll be doing on strontium to understand health effects and potential technologies for removing strontium from drinking water. Perchlorate, some of you have been kind of keeping an ear on what's happening on perchlorate. We're currently continuing to work through the recommendations from the Science Advisory Board on perchlorate. They recommended that we do additional modeling to understand the toxicity of perchlorate. That process is continuing between EPA and FDA. When we finish that modeling effort, we're going to be going through an independent external peer review process, so we're a ways off before there's further action on perchlorate. Let me just say that on revised TCR, you didn't ask a question about RTCR. But you know, the focus on RTCR is doing training in terms of implementation of RTCR, and that work's ongoing. We know it's going to be an important partnership with NRWA and others to try and make sure systems are ready to implement the rule. Two things I want to three things, additional things I want to touch on. Hopefully Jim and Mike are okay. Three additional things I want to touch on are storage tanks, Legionella, and algal toxins. Okay, so on storage tanks, some of you might recall that we had contemplated issuing a proposed rule on storage tanks at the same time that we did the final RTCR. We opted not to do that. We think it's an important time to circle back on storage tanks and ask questions about, so what is the current state of storage tanks across the U.S.? I am not announcing to you that we're doing a rule or proposing a rule on storage tanks. I'm announcing to you that we're going to be reaching out to you and your peers and others to try and have a clear understanding of what's the state of storage tanks and are the current regulations sufficient to address whatever concerns may be out there. One of the important parts of this is we can all find pretty scary pictures of storage tanks. There's no question. We can find dead birds in storage tanks. We can find holes in storage tanks. We can find lots of sediment in storage tanks. I don't think we have pictures, but in some situations you can find bodies in storage tanks. It's true. We need to be clear about what's representative of storage tanks across the U.S. and not look at the scariest pictures and make the assumption that they're representative of what we see all across the U.S. Okay, so we're going to be looking for help from you in understanding what we know about storage tanks and what would be the appropriate path forward on those. Legionella. In our work with CDC, we understand from CDC that Legionella is among the largest public health concerns related to drinking water in the United States today. We should be clear, this is kind of an unusual situation because we're not primarily talking about concern of exposure through drinking. We're talking about concern of exposure through inhalation. That could be from showering, that could be from fountains, that could be from hot tubs, that could be from HVAC systems. And so this doesn't fall within kind of the regulatory umbrella of the Safe Drinking Water Act. On Legionella, we're not talking about are we going to do a regulation on Legionella. We're talking about how to provide technical support, particularly to secondary drinking water treatment systems to make sure that when they're operating them appropriately so we don't see repeats of the situation of a VA hospital in Pittsburgh where you have soldiers who've gone overseas to fight for this country and come home and are in a VA hospital and die of Legionella. Right? So that's something that we're going to focus on with CDC and others, states and others, and we're working with ASDWA on this to try and make sure we understand what kind of recommendations will be most effective to help avoid that situation happening in the future, not a regulation. And then on algotoxins, there is an awful lot of attention right now on algotoxins coming out of Toledo. So I've got a pile of letters from different folks on the Hill. I've got governors who are asking about this. I've got a lot of folks from the public saying, what are we going to do? And understand in Toledo, the situation was really prompted. Mike Baker, are you in the room? No, he's over down the hall. So situation in Toledo was really prompted by detections of microcystin in the distribution system in Toledo that were above a threshold value that Ohio determined to be of concern. That ties back to the World Health Organization guidance of 2003 that relies on 1999 studies of 1 microgram per liter in drinking water as a guidance value saying below that they don't think there's hazard, above that there may be. That's what prompted Toledo to make, the mayor of Toledo to make the decision to do a don't drink, don't boil order for those 500,000 people. A lot of folks are saying, you know, 2003 is a long time ago. EPA, are you going to have anything to help us to understand a more updated view of what might be a safe level of microcystin and other algotoxins? So we are working right now on a health advisory for algotoxins. It's in peer review right now. One of the next critical stages once we complete the peer review is going to be to do some engagement with the public, with states, with communities to make sure we understand what's going to be the practical and appropriate way to apply a health advisory in decision making for when a system has to do some sort of a don't drink or don't boil order. It's a tremendously important issue, certainly for folks in Western Lake Erie, but it's not limited. As you all know, algal toxins and algal blooms are not limited just to the Lake Erie Basin. So we are planning on having this health advisory completed before the next algotoxin season, which means before roughly the springtime, end of the springtime of 2015. Also, not a regulatory action, a guidance to make sure that people are prepared to deal with these issues appropriately. So that's where I'm going to stop now, and I hope I haven't taken everybody's time, but glad to take questions if people have them at the appropriate time, and I know that Mike's probably got some stored up if anybody else doesn't have questions for us. Thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thank you very much, Peter. Those were excellent comments, and we're eager to hear now from Jim Taft.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be addressing the operators and technical assistance providers of the greatest water systems in the world. I have no doubt of that. So I wanted to kind of do a source to tap, kind of cover the waterfront of issues that are important to states, but also I think in the areas that have great intersection with rural water systems and technical assistance providers, which is just about everything that we work on. But let me just touch on some of the things that are kind of front of the brain for us, and I think probably for you folks as well. Some of which I think Peter has touched on, but let me start with implementation of recent rules. It sounded like from the earlier show of hands, we have the Stage 2 DBP rule as a real favorite, something that everybody loves, but that obviously is a very challenging rule with a lot of distribution system issues that are just plain complicated. And so I think we very much look forward to continuing to work with you and kind of working through some of those very tough issues. Peter touched on storage tanks. There was a very good session yesterday afternoon about that essentially gave the message that it is not rote, it is not easy. Every situation's different, and so kind of working through those with you, I think is a tough one. So Peter mentioned some of the regrowth, some of the microbiological contaminants. Legionella certainly is one that crops up in premise plumbing. Another one with a very sad history in Louisiana last year was Naegleria fowleri, which is not an ingestion-related contaminant, but up through the nasal passage can cause great harm. And so trying to get a handle on those distribution system issues, getting the right disinfectant residual, taking into account dead zones and so on, I think on a kind of a case-by-case, system-by-system basis is, I think, something that we will continue to look forward to working with you on in partnership. In the DBP rule, for instance, we have a lot of consecutive system issues. We have a lot of wholesalers selling to retailers, and that requires a lot of relationship, that requires a lot of communication. And the DBP rule, DBP Stage 2, triggers a lot of the requirements, perhaps for the first time, in ways that haven't been done before. And so I think trying to kind of cement those relationships and those understandings and the kind of the protocols is really an important area, I think, for you guys and your members to be involved in. Let me talk a little bit about some of the rules under review. The lead and copper rule was mentioned by Peter. They're looking at a range of issues from sample site collection, optimal corrosion control treatment, the lead sampling protocol, public education, partial lead service line replacement, just a host of very tough issues. And we, as I think, speaking for you, we're very appreciative of the opportunity to kind of take a step back, form a National Drinking Water Advisory Council working group comprised of state folks, rural water, larger utilities, public health folks, and really work through those issues. And so we're appreciative of that process. The understanding, I think, is that we will have kind of recommendations from that group in sort of the mid-spring time frame, with perhaps a proposed rule to follow sometime after that. Speaking of lead, another lead issue that it was very hot about a year ago this time that we haven't forgotten about is the Lead Reduction Act, the new definition of lead-free. And so that is a new requirement that we're grappling with. It's no longer 8%, it's 0.25%. And so one of the challenges that we face there from a state standpoint is that the folks that implement that are plumbing inspectors, typically. They're not state drinking water folks, and so to the extent that you are able to get the word out and disseminate information about that, I think that's helpful in getting those requirements implemented. EPA's frequently asked questions document is a good source of information to kind of work through some of the scenarios. Preparing to implement new rules, and I think probably the big dog here is the revised total coliform rule. We, as I think you were appreciative and welcoming of the new approach, which is really a find and fix approach, as opposed to total coliform violations. We think that's a superior public health standpoint to be taking. But it's going to be challenging. There are level 1 assessments, there are level 2 assessments, and each state is, I think, having training discussions about how specifically they plan to do that in their respective states. In probably most cases, the level 1 assessments will likely be done by the water utility. Level 2 assessments may be done by a state, may be done by the utility, may be done by a circuit rider or a TA provider. And so I think the message that I would have for you here is to encourage you to have conversations with your respective state drinking water program folks to figure out roles and responsibilities, how that's going to work in your state, so that you can be ready by April of 2016 for the implementation of that rule. And I'll anticipate a question that I think Mike will be asking. There are a few states, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, seems like another that I'm forgetting, that are planning to implement early. And so if they can get their state rules done on time and get their primacy packages reviewed and approved by EPA, that'll be launched early in those states. But for most states, it would be that April 2016 date. Consumer confidence reports. That was a very hot topic when we were in Louisville last year, because it had just been, I think, authorized at that point that we would have electronic CCRs as an implementation option. There again, we are very appreciative of the action that the agency took. We think that provides a range of options and some additional tools for us. And just to be clear, it is not a requirement. That is the electronic CCRs, but it is a tool in the toolbox that I think many utilities are making good use and taking advantage of, and we expect there's going to be more and more of that. And ideally, we'd like to even see more information, better information, as a result of the electronic capability, as opposed to sort of having hard copies where you have to really limit the amount of information you can provide. Let me touch very briefly on the whole topic of developing water system capacity. This is probably about 75% of what my guys spend their time on, working with water systems, working with technical assistance providers to work through some of the very challenging technical, managerial, and financial capacity issues. So they're essentially what we're involved in and have been involved in over the last several years is a process of sharing best practices. For the last couple of years, we focused on capacity development and non-community water systems, which is one of the more challenging areas. I should mention parenthetically that in implementing the RTCR, non-community systems, I think, is going to be a real challenge for all of us. But so sharing those best practices on the capacity development side and with respect to non-community systems as well. I think over the next couple of years, we would like to focus on operator certification and sharing some of the best practices there. And let me give you a quick date to put on your calendars. This hasn't been announced widely, but we're hoping that December 8th through the 10th, we'll have a capacity development operator certification workshop in Dallas, Texas, for EPA, states, technical assistance providers. So something perhaps to put on your calendar. Peter mentioned the Technical Assistance Awards. For those of you that haven't been following this very closely, I don't think that would be anybody in this audience. I think you guys are well aware of it. But it's been about $13 million or so through a national contract that then has had typically, I think, 4 awardees. So we're getting ready for we're implementing the second cycle of that and getting ready for the third. And so the key message there, I think, that we would have as states is let's talk. Let's stay in close communication with one another. as you guys provide technical assistance under those national contracts, and indeed under when states use some of their set-aside dollars for technical assistance, the more information we can get about what you're doing, what kind of results you're finding, what's worked, what hasn't worked, the better that we can tailor future assistance. One of the things that sort of drives us, frankly, is something called the ETT, the ETT score. Show of hands, who's heard of that? All right. So that is the enforcement targeting tool, and that's kind of the new way over the last couple of years that EPA's enforcement office has kind of prioritized violations. And we think it's actually a superior way to the way it was done in the past. So it's basically the severity of the violation and the duration of the violation. If you get points for that, and points greater than 11 is a significant violation. And so we want to get those significant violators back into compliance within 6 months or under some sort of formal action. So facilities with high ETT scores is a kind of an area that we really would like to work with you on in terms of focusing some of our assistance. Source water protection, Peter mentioned at a couple of points in his remarks, and this is one of the most important things I think that we can work on jointly together on. We've appreciated NRWA's leadership at the national level through folks like Bill O'Connell and through the local level, and actually working with communities to develop source water protection plans. And those of you that are engaged in source water protection know that it's a team sport. It's nothing that we have the authorities and all of the dollars that we need to affect change within the drinking water program. And so it's all about leveraging and partnerships to be as preventative as we possibly can, and then to have protocols and procedures in place if something goes wrong to react, to mitigate, to be resilient. So we're part of something, as are you guys through your national office, in something called the Source Water Collaborative. So we have worked with groups like USDA and NRCS to provide a toolkit so that we can have better interactions with them, more frequent, more meaningful interactions. We've done the same thing with NACD, the National Association of Conservation Districts, to kind of get at the county and local level. And so leveraging non-point and point source controls that frankly others manage is important for us in terms of source water protection. And so we've worked a lot with our Clean Water Act colleagues in terms of getting the right water quality standards in place, TMDLs, NPDES permits, non-point source controls, et cetera. If nothing else, we think the event in West Virginia, the event in Toledo, create a teachable moment. One of the points that Peter made yesterday, actually, at a luncheon, which I was struck by and I absolutely agree with, is that the lesson from those events is not the greatest problems that we all face are algal toxins and above-ground chemical storage tanks. Those are indeed problems, but it's the full range of things that can potentially affect and impair sources of drinking water, which put more pressure on the treatment facility. Some of those things pass through untreated. And so anything that we can do to leverage one another's authorities and resources to affect better control of the source, I think is a plus. Let me touch very briefly on drinking water security, which relates very closely to source water protection. Because security these days, as you guys well know, is really a sort of an all hazards, all events kind of approach. There have been just a series of very stellar interactions by state rural water affiliates in the event, in the instance of particular tornadoes and hurricanes and storms and nor'easters that have come through your particular states. I think we've seen rural water affiliates really leading the way in some of the mitigation and resiliency efforts. At the national level, you've been represented very well by Charles Hilton in the Water Sector Coordinating Council, which works through some of the national tools and relationships and interactions with some of the other national groups. So All hazards resiliency, I think, and the approach that we need to take is not kind of a boutique program when we have time, but obviously sort of part and parcel to how we do business. And I think one of the challenges we face is as we develop those tools, making sure that they are applicable, usable, appropriate for small systems. So there's a tool, for instance, called CREATE, Climate Ready Evaluation and Assessment Tool. The first iteration of that really probably had more of a large system focus. I think we've worked very hard to try to make sure that it's geared to and appropriate for smaller systems. And so working through the tool mix and the toolkit on that, I think, is important. So I think I'm going to wind up there and just mention very briefly that, as Peter mentioned, that we are very pleased and proud and appreciative of the work that we've done together under the Safe Drinking Water Act in this year of the 40th anniversary. That's actually going to culminate in mid-December, but there will be some national events, and I'm sure a lot of state and local events as well. And I'll just mention that it's the 30th anniversary of ASDWA as well. So thanks for all of the hard work and the important work that you do every day. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Jim. That's very helpful. And please welcome Mike Paik.
Thank you, Mike. I'm pleased to be here this morning. I had the chance to talk to you all 2 years ago. And what I'd like to do today is, in fact, give you an overview or an opening statement. Very briefly, the Groundwater Protection Council is kind of a unique organization. Half of our board of directors are people that, many of whom are on Jim Taft's board of directors, run drinking water programs. But part of that responsibility, and I might use Ohio as an example, part of that responsibility under the Safe Drinking Water Act is the Underground Injection Control Program, which I'll talk about in a minute. But in the instance of Ohio, the division or department and the individual who runs the drinking water program also administers the Underground Injection Control Program, except for oil and gas, and I'll get into that. But the other half of our board are people that regulate, in fact, underground injection. And I'll mention a little bit about that here in a second, but it's principally people that regulate two types of wells, Class 5 wells, which are in some cases almost holes in the ground, or industrial septic systems might be a good example, something that's simple to something as complex as a solution mining operation, whether mining uranium or salt, oil and gas, obviously, and then hazardous waste disposal. The entire UIC program at the federal level falls within Peter Gravat's shop, and hence our relationship and a regulatory relationship with EPA Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. It's no news to any of you that more systems are on groundwater and rely on groundwater than surface water, although the population differential is significant. But we all know that groundwater is a significant source of drinking water on a system basis. What's interesting, I think, a little bit about that is that groundwater, and I kind of look at it this way, but groundwater is everywhere. Surface water is where you find it. But I like to think of groundwater as being a little bit more of a rural issue. If we get out of the Philadelphias and the Chicagos, indeed groundwater there, but it becomes a little bit more of a rural not an issue, but used rurally. And I know there are a number of large systems that use both groundwater and drinking water, as my hometown of Oklahoma City does. But for the moment, let's just think rural. What's another unique thing about groundwater, if you remember, Tip O'Neill said all politics are local. Well, he was right, but and that changes with the internet. All groundwater is local, and it always has been, and it always will be. It's underneath your feet. You're standing on it, and that's pretty local. The way we look at groundwater varies from the east to the west. If you live on one side of the 48th meridian, you may have a view if you're a state agency or an individual owner of groundwater. In one direction, if you live west, you might have another view. And where that gets interesting is in the issue of waters of the U.S. Groundwater Protection Council will not take a position on whether we're for or against or have any strategic view of how we might carve up waters of the U.S. And it's part of that is based on the fact that some of us in the West own that groundwater, and we might not think that the federal government needs to have too much to do with the water under our feet. You may disagree, but that is a prevailing Western view. But we still have the Safe Drinking Water Act and Clean Water Act, and they're very, very valuable tools. It's the core of what we do to protect groundwater using those two water acts. And there are other ways to protect groundwater, but those are principal among them. And so we come to, as Groundwater Protection Council and those regulators I was talking about, we come to the table very, very willingly with ASDWA and another sister organization, ACWA, the Clean Water Act group, and we talk about things like source water protection. And I think the Source Water Collaborative is a fundamental key to protecting groundwater. Some of the ways we protect groundwater is almost as an ombudsman. We don't have the federal laws in place. Again, we'll get to underground injection. And you have to have protection of groundwater in your heart. And I would commend you to our website. We have a document called the Groundwater Report to the Nation, and it's an advocacy piece that talks about protecting groundwater from different perspectives. You might take a look at that. So groundwater and surface water, though, do interact. You all know that. We have, if you live in western Oklahoma, southern Colorado, or anywhere in the arid west, and you see a stream flowing in the summertime, you're looking at groundwater. If you see a farm pond in August in the Texas Panhandle, you're looking at groundwater. That stuff isn't there because of the heavy rainfalls and surface flow into it. Now, there's obvious exceptions, but we know that groundwater impacts surface water, and it merits a lot of attention for that reason. We also get concerned about things, stormwater, infiltration from stormwater, which is an urban issue and a rural issue. We look for tools like TMDLs. We look for tools like NPDES programs to help to promote correct discharge into streams, recognizing that some of that water is going to get back into groundwater, and some of it came from groundwater, and some of it's going to infiltrate into groundwater. So some limited tools. But let me move on let me ask you a question. How many people in the room own the mineral rights, not water, but oil or gas, or stripper wells or any of that sort of thing? How many? You can admit it here. They won't hear you. How many people own any oil production? A dozen, maybe. I asked that same question 2 years ago. It was about the same. Well, were you the ones that clapped that you thought hydraulic fracturing didn't cause any problems? No, okay, all right. Well, the Underground Injection Control Program is our regulatory tool, and again, we recognize the value of the Clean Water Act and other pieces of the Safe Drinking Water Act and source water protection. But the Underground Injection Control Program is a bit unique. There are 6 types of injection wells in the country, any of which type can contaminate groundwater. They're all guilty until proven innocent. And we try to prove them innocent by having good regulations and good oversight and ensuring good compliance in any of those types of wells. Very briefly, the Class 1 wells are hazardous waste disposal. There aren't but 500 in the country, and there aren't that many of those that are active, and those get a lot of attention. And you may drive by one and never know it's there, but when there have been problems historically, not recently, and they are low in number, but the potential for problems if there was a leak or discharge to a groundwater could be substantial. I'll come back to the Class 2 wells, which is oil and gas. Class 3 wells are solution mining, and kind of there are more wells than there are sites for the wells, and then these are usually galleries where there's any number of wells dissolving uranium or salt and other minerals, but principally uranium and salt out, and we regulate those somewhat differently, but still under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Class 4 wells I'll skip by. They're banned, and the Class 5 wells, there are probably, depending on the data Peter and I get, anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million. It varies, but they are not holes in the ground, but septic tanks, small operations that are discharging water. It could be a stormwater return well that is permitted or not permitted. But one of the concerns about Class 5 wells is there may be half or more that aren't they're regulated, but they're not permitted. And we worry about those, but I'm going to skip by those here today. So what are the states through the GWPC doing to help themselves, the states, get a better handle on underground injection and manage it? One of the things that, if I can talk about produced water from oil and gas operations, I have to take my glasses off here. We did a study in 2009 that we're updating, and in 2009 there were 22.8 billion barrels of water, produced water, re-injected. 22.8 billion barrels, 42 gallons to a barrel, right? 42 times 22 billion, you're hitting a trillion. So on an average day from oil and gas, there's re-injected in this country 2 billion gallons of water. So while we're all here today, you woke up this morning, you're going to wake up tomorrow, 2 billion gallons of water re-injected under the ground. If you do that wrong, you've got some serious problems, and so it shows the magnitude of that program, but I think that we recognize that certainly, and it's also attests to the fact that the program is run pretty doggone good by the states and by the industry, and regulated well through construction standards, or with 20.8 billion barrels, or almost a trillion gallons a year injected, and that's every year, and it's going up every year. We must be doing something right. And that's not to say things don't go wrong and aren't going wrong, but we must be doing something right. So what are we doing? You've heard about induced seismic events, earthquakes. The Groundwater Protection Council, and I mean the states here, have formed a work group. Peter Gravat's staff, or one of the regional offices, serves on it. We've got 12 states assembled working on induced seismicity, 8 universities, 4 state seismologists, and a dozen state geologists working on ways to develop voluntary guidelines for dealing with induced seismic events, in some cases caused by produced water being injected into a faulted area, and in some cases just dealing with separating the phenomena of swarms of earthquakes, which are naturally occurring, and induced earthquakes, which are and can and are caused by misplaced injection wells. And so we're working actively on that, and I think Peter is developing guidance report, and we are going to be developing guidelines, and I would say stay tuned, but we certainly recognize that that's a problem. Let me talk about hydraulic fracturing and wrap up. Hydraulic fracturing, it's interesting. I talk about it all the time, and it's really, when you were clapping your hands, you don't have to explain this to me, but what I get when I'm out giving talks is that hydraulic fracturing is a phrase used synonymously for oil and gas production. A lot of us don't like the intrusive nature of oil and gas production. If you live in Bradford County, Pennsylvania, you had a pristine little farm or summer home, and in comes an oil company and trucks and bulldozers and a drilling rig and all that sort of stuff. It's just not a nice situation, unless you own the minerals, and then it's wonderful. It's like heaven. But anyway, so we do recognize that. That's very, very, very simply understood. But that's not hydraulic fracturing. Hydraulic fracturing is a very small temporal event that takes place over a very short period of time at 1 mile and 2 miles underground. It's done, fluids are injected, and I won't go into all that. Chemicals are put in the ground. They come back out, not 100% of them, and then we have a challenge on how we get rid of those chemicals. But hydraulic fracturing itself, in our view, and I believe currently in the EPA's view, we have yet to find a direct correlation between a public water supply being contaminated by the act of hydraulic fracturing. Public water supplies and private wells are contaminated by oil and gas production. That's a fact, and that's something we understand, and that's why we regulate, is because that can happen if we don't stay on the job. But there is an intrusive part of that. So one of the ways that the states have tried to be helpful in this regard is develop a system called Frac Focus. How many have gone to Frac Focus website? Well, right after this meeting, you need to rush back to your rooms and go to the Frac Focus website. The states created Frac Focus for the individual landowners to be able to look at a well in their neighborhood, next in the farm, in the section over, whatever it is in your particular case, to be able to go past that well and find out information that was heretofore not readily available. It was available, but it was hard to get. So what Frac Focus does is gives anyone in this room the ability to go on the internet, Google Frac Focus, and through Google Earth or any other way you want, zero in on a particular well and find out what chemicals are going down it. It's not been without a challenge programmatically to make Frac Focus better. And while I'm standing here, we have a day-long meeting going on with the industry and a number of NGOs to improve Frac Focus, improve the accuracy, improve the transparency and its ability to serve you. But within 2 years, we've recorded 80,000 frac jobs in Frac Focus. We have 1,000 companies reporting to Frac Focus, some of them because of regulatory requirements and some of them voluntarily. And as I said, we're working hard to make it better, and I hope if I'm talking to you in a year, I can report on a lot of progress on that. And lastly, the other thing that helps us regulate, and I'm staying with the Class 2 program because of those volumes and the potential problems with it, is something called risk-based data management. And it's a system that has been developed by 26 states to manage their Class 2 programs, and in some states' cases, their Class 1 or hazardous waste programs, and in 2 states, their Class 5 program. But it allows the regulators to increase transparency, like we're doing with the Energy Information Administration. Built them a portal so that anyone in this room can go through that portal and get information on wells in their area. Again, this is oil and gas. But gives the regulators the ability electronically to use an iPad or a smartphone and go out in the field and get information on a particular well. Be more responsive to the industry, they regulate, but even more than that, be more transparent with the people that they serve. And we think it's an ever-evolving process, but we think it's a good tool for regulating oil and gas industry. And I'll leave with one thought. There's actually an app that if you go on the Oklahoma website or the Colorado website, you can find an app, and it's a smartphone app, and you put that on. If we're going to put this out on our website, you'll be able to click on that smartphone app wherever you live, and it knows where you are, obviously, and it knows where the nearest well is, and you'll click on that, and you'll get the information, chemical information and other information off those injection wells or producing wells that are next to your car, farm, house, or whatever the case might be. So with that, that's a snapshot of that program, and thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much, Mike, and the rest of the panelists. Now is the time of the session that we can open up the panel for questions or concerns or comments from the audience. So please work your way to the microphones. If you've ever asked me a question about water regulation, you had the wrong answer, and now you have an opportunity to get the right answer if you want to ask. But as you're working your way to the microphones, I did want a couple of the comments precipitated some more questions for me to the audience that I think might be interesting. And if I ask you a question, I'm curious if you're going to give me the correct answer here, but I won't know until I ask. But is everybody aware in here of the Lead Reduction Act compliance date of January 4th of this year? Did I misstate that? Everyone's aware of it, right? Okay, so here's the other part of it. Would anybody let us know if you still have leaded brass inventories? Okay, so who clap if you still have existing leaded brass inventories? All right, I won't ask you what you're doing unless you want to volunteer it. But the other survey I wanted to ask is, Does your water system have a current source water protection plan? Do you have something that you actually call the source water protection plan? How many of you have one? Okay, that's good to know. I know there's varying degrees, and maybe some of you could explain it if you're interested. But we'll go ahead and take a first question.
Over here?
Please.
Yeah. I've made the statement more than once, unless you live on top of the mountain, your source water is somebody else's wastewater. One of the solutions we're recommending for wastewater systems to comply with nitrates and phosphates is to get in. There's a couple of companies that are doing algae lagoons to absorb the nutrients that used to be called pollutants. Having said that, I've never understood or never had it explained to me, in the case of Toledo, they had an algae bloom that was generating toxins that got into their system. They shut down for 5 days, and then they started back up. What did they do?
Yes, please.
Okay, thanks very much. That's a great question, an important one. So Toledo was shut down for about 2 days, 2.5 days in the beginning of August. And understand that the algal bloom in western Lake Erie is not a new story, right? Actually, algal blooms were common long before we were doing a lot of work to implement the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. We made a lot of progress in Lake Erie, and now we're challenged again. And I'll say that I think there isn't anyone that can say that they understand with certainty exactly how all the different factors that contribute to harmful algal blooms are playing out in western Lake Erie. So that's an ongoing challenge. But we know that warm water and nutrients are two of the important factors that help algae to grow. There may be other issues there, and western Lake Erie tends to be very shallow. And NOAA, for years, the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, does great mapping for algal blooms. And if you look back and see the pictures of the algal bloom in western Lake Erie, and you look at where Toledo is, it doesn't take a lot to figure out what was going on there. So there were a lot of challenges during the response in Toledo, and Mike Baker and I were two who were engaged in those conversations about how to solve the problem. But at the same time that there was very aggressive sampling being done both at the treatment plant, various stages in the treatment plant, and in the distribution system, EPA and the state were advising Toledo on ways that they could adjust their treatment system to try and address the algal toxins that were breaking through. And so there are some key factors that we know. Filtration is very important. Chlorination is very important. And then the use of activated carbon is very important to pull out the algal toxins. So it was a combination of trying to understand where the algal toxins were in the system, but also trying to raise the treatment train within Toledo. And it's important to recognize that Toledo was both a source water protection challenge and an infrastructure failure. Okay, so in Toledo this summer was not the highest levels of algal toxins they had been faced with at their intake. In the past, there were times when they had even higher levels that they were able to remove through their treatment train. They had to make some adjustments in August to address that. But needless to say, it was 500,000 people who were waiting over the course of a weekend for that progress to take place. And some really challenging sampling and analytical activities that went along with that. So that's probably a long answer to your question. But at the same time they were dealing with understanding where the algal toxins were, they were really focused on how do we adjust the system to try and get these out.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add, Jim? And are these on? Yes. Next question, please, Jim.
Good morning. I have $30,000 worth of leaded brass on the shelf. I purchased non-leaded brass in December when I thought we weren't going to be able to get the stranded inventory fixed. My two questions. The first is, are there any states that do not have primacy jurisdiction for drinking water? How many would there be?
There's one, state of Wyoming.
Thank you. In my situation, this question, I guess, would be for Dr. Gravatt, considering your current position as well as your expertise in child health. And I have radiological exceedance. On gross alpha, my running average was 15.52, which rounds to 16, as opposed to the MCL of 15. And my question is, for something like radiologicals, where there is a no threshold science to establish the MCL, no low threshold science, and that it's strictly based on backtracking from nuclear disasters in Nagasaki, Hiroshima, Bikini Atoll, nuclear accidents, etc. My question is it appropriate to require the water authority, the local water authority, to treat to the MCLG, the goal of 0, which whole radiologicals are 0, as opposed to permitting them to enable such as a partial treatment to get below, for example, the MCL of 15, treat a quarter of it, blend back 3/4 untreated, and bring it down to about 12, saving millions of dollars and not concentrating the radiological waste stream that already is part of our system. How do you feel about the goal treatment versus the MCL?
All right, so that is a really good question and a pretty complicated one. And what I'll say is a couple things. First is radionuclides are one of those compounds that are known without question to be carcinogenic. And so it's important that we focus on radionuclides. I think it's probably in part a matter of how the state drinking water administrators who have primacy can work with local communities to understand how to address the challenges with radionuclides. And I know that there are many. And I can't speak to how the discussions have played out within your state in terms of blending as an approach. It's something I'd be happy to talk further about if you want to help me understand better how you've addressed those challenges and how they're playing out. But I think, suffice it to say that we do have MCLs and we have MCLGs, and for all carcinogens, the MCLG is 0, and that does not mean that we have the expectation that all the drinking water systems are going to meet 0. It means they have to meet the MCL. That's the standard on the books. So, but I'd be happy to talk further about that if you'd like.
Thanks, Jim. Let's hear from Virginia. Mark?
Hey, good morning. You mentioned strontium at the first of your talk, and being in Halifax County, Virginia, downstream of the second largest coal ash release in U.S. history, and knowing that strontium is one of those elements that are tied to coal ash. Now, 8 months later, it's probably a legacy issue on our river that we'll have to deal with from here on out in the future. But my question is, we have a number of unlined coal ash ponds in the region, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, all of those areas. Is there a federal vehicle in place where our ratepayers will not have to pay for additional special treatment to remove these elements and these contaminants when we weren't the ones who were responsible for their admittance in their surface waters or groundwaters? Thank you.
Thank you. So you got a bunch of good questions today and challenging questions. And I think this one is really, I see as an important source water protection question, and it speaks to ultimately who bears the responsibility and who bears the cost of addressing a contaminant that might be in the source water for a particular system. I think it's very difficult, in fact, it's not possible to say for any given drinking water system that they don't have to meet the federal standard in place. But it's an important question about who's going to bear the responsibility of helping systems to do that. And I think that's part of what plays out in the situation of like Toledo as well. So, part of what I've talked about as I've been working with folks on the response to the algal bloom in Toledo is to say, you know, we cannot put all of the burden on the shoulders of the drinking water treatment systems and the ratepayers in a given community to deal with a problem that somebody else has created. I think that speaks to the situation that you're talking about, and in the case of algal blooms, it's a pretty complicated one, and we are not pointing the finger at any particular entity on algal blooms. We're saying we understand that nutrients are a factor, and nutrients come from urban areas, they come from suburban areas, they come from rural areas, and we need to look kind of comprehensively about how to address those. Jim made mention of source water assessments, and I think in this case that it's a perfect example of you have a pretty clear idea, it sounds like, where some of the source is, and you're going to need some help from folks to deal with this issue. You can't bear the full burden. I mean, there is an action ongoing in EPA to look at coal ash facilities, in part coming out of what happened. That you said you're the second sort of largest incident of a coal ash spill, and certainly there have been others that are very significant. So I understand it's an ongoing challenge, and I think it's going to be important for communities to roll up their sleeves and say, how are we going to solve this together? Because otherwise it's the residents who are bearing all the burden, and you are trying to find a way to pull this stuff out that may be very challenging from an engineering standpoint.
Thanks, Mark, and I imagine you have a lawyer involved already. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, Mike. Dennis Beck from Pennsylvania. I've got two questions in two different areas. Number one on hydraulic fracturing. Too many people have been concerned about the chemicals that they put in and they pump down to do the fracturing. That's not the problem. I don't care what they put down. The problem is the production water that comes back up, because that's much, much more dangerous and contaminated, and the elements that are in there are just scary, that are coming back up. In one instance in Westmoreland County in Pennsylvania, one of the water trucks was taking some drilling mud and water from a hydrofracturing site in a Marcellus Shale area to a landfill for disposal, and the Geiger counter at the gate went off. And all the landfills in Pennsylvania have Geiger counters to check for radioactivity at the gate because of the radioactive waste from hospitals from years ago. So they were required to put these Geiger counters in. So it stopped this truck because the Geiger counter went off, and they went through several stages of trying to figure out what to do with it, and that truck eventually had to go to Idaho to have it disposed of. So the big push was, instead of taking it to a landfill, to do injection wells. And I'm not sure where all that production water from Pennsylvania is going, but it's a good question as to where it's going. DEP's been way behind schedule on controlling where that water is going. So that's one question or one comment. The second one is on phosphorus and nitrogen. 20 years ago, EPA did a study and found that 20% of those nutrients came from non-point sources, and 80% came from point sources. So they went after the wastewater plants. Well, a study in the last 5 years has reversed that, and they have found that 80% is coming from non-point sources, whether it's farms or ranches or whatever, and only 20% of those nutrients are coming from wastewater plants or factories. I wish more of that would go out, because the wastewater plants have really taken a lot of abuse and expense on trying to reduce their phosphorus and nitrogen levels. And they're finding out now that most of it's coming from non-point sources. The wastewater industry has reduced those levels significantly from what they're producing and what they're putting out into the streams, but the levels are still too high, especially for the Chesapeake area where they've got separate regulations. But now they're looking at the non-point sources, and I'm on the Conservation District Board in the county, and if you want to talk about radicals, people very, very concerned about regulations, it's the farmers, and they're saying, don't tell us. Don't tell us what we can do with our farms, because we know what to do with our farms. But the over-fertilization and some of the other controls, the riparian barriers are important stuff to them. But just a couple comments on those two different areas.
Yeah, on the, is this on?
Yep.
On the concern for the flowback, I appreciate you saying that the chemicals go down and you understand that particular location of the chemicals during the fracture process is not one that you were particularly concerned with. Not that we shouldn't understand it, but that gets back to my comment on the actual act of fracking takes place over days or a week, and it's water coming back out that becomes a problem. Interesting fact, when the chemicals are added to fracture fluid, what goes down the hole is never what comes back up. And I think that gets to your point about radioactive material. As a general rule, and probably as a 100% rule, companies aren't adding radioactive materials as a part of their frac fluid. They pick up the radioactive material from the formation into which they're injecting. So it's naturally occurring, and it comes back up whole. So what you do with the radioactive materials is probably one of the more serious things that you have to deal with when you're dealing with waste disposal. There are guidelines for and regulatory program for disposing of radioactive material associated with oil and gas production water in disposal wells, and you expressed a concern about the disposal wells. They are Class 2 wells is what you're talking about, and they're a permitted well, and the operator has to demonstrate to the state an area of review beyond which the fluid should not travel in a period of years, whether it's 5 years or 10 years. And I'd suggest to you that in Pennsylvania, you might, and I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards, you might pay attention to how their rules for underground injection are determined that way. But as it works out in Pennsylvania, US EPA regional office runs the injection well program. That's not pushing anything off. I'm just saying that those standards apply to EPA or the state. It doesn't matter. But that's one thing you want to be concerned with. How is that Class 2 well constructed? If it's used as a facility to dispose of oil and gas produced waste, and where is it going? And those are things that the regulatory agency should know. Did that answer your question? Kind of.
Comments?
On the second question, a very good observation, I think, on sources of nitrogen. You're right. I think if you look nationwide, I think the lion's share of the problem is non-point source, but it's also a very site-specific kind of issue and problem. In some areas, publicly owned treatment works do contribute a pretty significant chunk of the nitrogen load. So it becomes, I think, a site-by-site, case-by-case analysis. It certainly doesn't make sense to kind of use the blunt instrument of an NPDES permit to kind of be ratcheting down on 10% of the problem when 90% may be really what needs attention in a particular area. So I think it requires good data, good information. With respect to non-point source controls and the notion of working with farmers, and it is a challenge because we're talking about voluntary measures, and we're talking about incentives. And so the tact that we've taken is to try to partner like crazy, especially with groups like USDA, NRCS, and all of the various programs that they have to try to leverage and influence the kinds of demonstration projects and activities that they have going on that put in place non-point source controls where they're most needed. I think by and large, for the most part, I think farmers are very conscientious in doing what's required and what's needed, but there's more to be done, obviously.
We're getting close to the end of the session here on time, and I was just going to ask the panel if you wanted to make any closing thoughts to the audience. It's not required.
Well, I think I'll make one, and that's, I guess, to start is, let me just stand up. To start is to say thank you so much for everything you do every day, and thank you for the opportunity to come and get to meet you and to be with you. And I really can't overstate the benefit of say, visiting Oklahoma or going down and seeing Doug in Georgia or Charles in South Carolina. And I made the comment a couple times today that in the experience of Toledo, and not to harp too much on that, but midnight on a phone call with the governor of Ohio and the mayor of Toledo is not the time to try and get to know a colleague. It's very hard to put a value on, in my case, the working relationship that I have with Mike Baker that has really grown out of experiences like this. So at midnight on that call, for Mike Baker to not be in the position to say, who is this yo-yo Gravatt anyway? I mean, he may have been saying that, but, to know each other and to be able to have that trust in an emergency situation is invaluable. And to know the people who we regulate and to understand the work you do every day is invaluable in trying to have a sensible approach moving forward. So I would say thank you for the opportunity to be here. And when I'm in your state, I'm eager to, meet you folks, whether I'm coming to that state for the purpose of visiting small systems or I'm coming to that state for another conference. Let's get together and help me understand what I need to know about the work that you do and how we can help you the most. I mean, that's, I think, what's really important to me. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you.
Very nice. Thank you. We're going to close now, but I'd like to just observe that these three gentlemen represent some of the most beneficial and valuable partnerships that we have for rural water. We're grateful for that, and if you please show some appreciation with me. Thank you very much. Well done. Thank you. Thank you very much. The one thing trade associations do is give awards away. Yeah, right. So something will be coming. Yeah.